Didn't somebody once say that man cannot live by bread alone? Well, I couldn't agree more. There's a lot of things other than bread that are important to sustain life, like football and popcorn. Hello, I'm Scott Foster. Welcome to Rain Country, where this week our menu includes food and drink. Of course, not everybody eats off the same menu, and apparently there are people who don't watch football on TV. I know I've met people who actually think that yellow popcorn is better than white. And then there are some who argue about the quality of different kinds of beer.
The big American brews are what I call sport beers. There's no taste to them. There's no satisfaction. People will hammer them down because there's nothing fulfilling there. Well, a good home brew, you sip and you enjoy it.
George Reifenstein is just one Southeast resident who takes great pleasure in brewing his own beer. In addition to following recipes, little things make a difference in the final quality.
First and foremost is getting things clean.
The actual brewing begins with 1.5 gallons of water. To that are added the ingredients. The first is the wort.
This will be the main flavor of the beer. This will be give it that wheat and barley flavor. Okay, now I'm going to measure the hops and add those to the brew.
George uses about 2 ounces of hops, which, like most other ingredients, are ordered from outside.
Okay. So then I'll add this in. And this, the hops, these are the bittering hops at this stage of the brew. They'll be in there the whole process. And
the hops, George explains, give the beer its pleasantly bitter taste and character.
Now we're going to add the spruce tips. This is going to be a wheat beer with a spruce flavoring to it, and so we just picked these tips out in the woods here last night. And the smell in the room here should get pretty interesting as this starts. And you add something like spruce or ginger or anise. I like to put in sometimes star anise, just grind it up and put it in, is that you don't, on the initial taste, running it over your tongue, you don't pick it up. After you swallow, it kind of comes back and kicks you in the taste bud and says, hey, gotcha.
Homebrew can be inexpensive once the equipment is bought. George's first beers cost about 9 cents a bottle. Now, using more expensive ingredients to produce import quality beer, it costs about 50 cents a bottle. Labor, of course, is free.
At this point, I'm going to put in the Irish moss. And Irish moss is a seaweed. And you put in about a teaspoonful. And what it does is it settles out the proteins, and it will give you a much clearer product. You boil these for roughly an hour to break down the starch content into sugar so it's ready for fermenting. And then we will add this to about 4 gallons of cold water. This is the tricky part.
Following this mixing, George filters out the remains of the spruce needles and hops that had been added earlier. If he didn't, the final brew would be cloudy, and that would detract from its visual appeal. The next task is to get the liquid's temperature to just under 70 degrees. When that's done, it's time for one of the last steps in the brewing process, adding the yeast.
And then the yeast is just this fine little granules. This is an English ale yeast that's imported. And you just sprinkle it around the top. This will become a living organism very shortly, and will be doing its thing. In fact, by morning I'll see a little bit of action, and by tomorrow night it should be really going.
This fermentation process continues for 7 to 10 days. Finally, the brew is siphoned out of the fermenting container. As with each step, some care is taken.
You try not to get too much air into it, like you don't just let it splash in there, because the air mixing into it, you're liable to mix in some undesirable spores or whatever.
The evidence of the yeast's action remains around the top of the fermenting bucket and the bottom.
As it completed the fermentation process, it sank to the bottom of this fermenter, and then you can see down there where it's settled out.
At this stage, the brew is primed by adding a mixture of corn sugar and water. George calls this the sugar kick. What it does is add carbonation. The more that's added, the more bubbly the brew.
This is the priming. This is the corn sugar and water mixture.
To this point, George has invested about 2.5 hours total time for cooking and cleaning. Finally, he can start getting a feel and a smell for how this batch is coming along.
Looks good.
And then he's ready for the last step, the bottling.
I just use a simple hand capper. I do boil the caps first, just in case there could have been something odd get in there, and just to sterilize them. And just to try to line up bottles of the same size so that you're not going back and forth in the adjustment of the capper.
George says there's a lot of home brewing going on in Southeast, and particularly in more remote communities where transportation costs are higher.
That's probably where some of the better brews in Southeast are made, or in these very small communities where the delivery is that much more difficult, and you're paying so much more for the weight. You can just brew such good beer yourself. My rule of thumb is, for most beers, once you bottle them, if you can let them go 5 weeks, they're great. Too many people will taste them at 3 weeks, say this is great, and they share it with everybody, and it never reaches the full potential. It just gets better with a few extra weeks. That's why on my label it says patience. I think there's a certain enjoyment about sharing something you've made with others. It's just like why a lot of people make jam up here, a lot of people can salmon. It's not just for your own consumption. There's a pride in making something yourself that you can share with other people and say, look, I made this. It's not made for high alcohol content, it's made for enjoyment.